For the large pumpkin, I used one of the large fish bowl vases, and for the smaller pumpkin, I used one of the small fish bowl vases. Both came from Dollar Tree. First, I removed the stickers from the bottom of both vases. Then, starting with the larger vase, I flipped it over and put a dab of hot glue in the center of the bottom of the vase, and using some jute cord I picked up at Walmart, wrapped it around the vase to create the sections of the pumpkin. I wanted the pumpkin to have 8 sections, so I wrapped the jute cord around the vase 4 times, going in a different direction each time, and made sure to glue the jute cord to the same area on the center each time I wrapped it around the vase. Now that I had all 8 sections on the vase, I then created the pumpkin stem by using the same jute cord. I started in the middle where all the jute crossed on top of the pumpkin and wrapped the jute cord in a circle using hot glue to secure it in place. Then I continued to use hot glue and wrap the jute on itself to create the stem. I wanted the stem on the larger pumpkin to be a bit shorter than the stem on the smaller pumpkin, but you can make the stems as tall or as short as you like. Once I was happy with the length of the stem, I put some hot glue down in the center and tucked the cut end of the jute down inside to close it off. Next, I moved the jute sections around to where they look somewhat evenly spaced. Then I flipped the pumpkin upside down and used some hot glue to tack the jute in place. I then repeated the same process on the smaller vase. Once I had both pumpkins made, I took a lighter and burned off the fuzzy pieces of the jute. Now this part is completely optional, and if you do decide to do this step, please be very careful not to burn yourself. I decided to do this because I like the cleaner look that it gives the jute cord, and to me it makes it look a little more rustic. To add a little bit of embellishment to these pumpkins, I decided to take some of the leaves off this pick from Dollar Tree and picked out a couple of the leaves that I like best and cut them apart. Then using hot glue, I glued them into place beside the stems on the pumpkins. To make a curly tendril for each of the pumpkins, I used this wired jute cord from Dollar Tree and wrapped it a few times around a pencil, then I hot glued it into place. Since I wanted both of the pumpkins to be a little bit different, I made the tendril for the larger pumpkin just a little bit longer than the one that I made for the smaller one. To finish the smaller pumpkin, I took 1 string of the white LED string lights from Dollar Tree and put them inside of the pumpkin from the bottom. Then for the larger pumpkin, I took 1 string of the orange LED string lights, also from Dollar Tree, that I picked up last fall, and put them inside the pumpkin. I am absolutely in love with these lighted pumpkins. They were so quick, easy, and cost just a few dollars to make. For this DIY, I went out and picked up a couple of sticks from the yard and measured 2 of them from the bottom tier to the middle tier of my tiered tray so that the ladder would be the perfect height for my tray. Since I was somehow lucky enough to pick 2 sticks that were the perfect height to begin with, I then took another of the sticks and measured out how long each step needed to be, and cut one to size so that I could use it as a guide for my other 3 steps. Once I had all the steps cut to size, I used some hot glue to secure them into place. Again, when I was doing this project, I wanted sticks that were somewhat straight but not perfect because I wanted an old rustic look, so I made sure to keep that in mind while I was out looking for sticks. After all the steps were glued onto the ladder, I decided to take some twine from Dollar Tree and wrap it in an X shape around each side of each step, using hot glue to hold it into place. This gives the steps more security as well as really brings out the rustic look that I was going for with this tiered tray set. To make a little apple picking basket, I used the lid from a bottle of water and some of the smaller craft sticks from Dollar Tree. I measured out how tall I wanted the basket to be and then cut both ends of 5 craft sticks to size so that I would have 9 pieces to make the basket. Once I had all 9 pieces cut, I used hot glue and glued them all the way around the outside of the lid with the cut side pointed down. I wanted the little round ends of the craft sticks to be the top of the basket. Now that the basket was put together, I took some of the twine from Dollar Tree and hot glued it around the basket just a little bit from the top to give it some added security and a little more rustic charm. To make the basket look even more rustic, I took apple barrel paint in the color Country Gray and gave the entire basket 1 coat of the paint. This paint is very light and it really lets the wood grain of the craft sticks come through, so I didn't paint it on too heavy because that's the look I was wanting. I did give the bottom several coats to give it a finished look and to cover up the green color. And since you can't have an apple basket without apples, I made some tiny apples using 3 tiny wood beads that I got in a huge assortment from Amazon and put them on a skewer. I then painted one in Folk Art Apple Red, one in Apple Barrel Spring Green, and one in Delta Crocus Yellow. I only had to give each of these beads 1 coat of color. Once the beads were completely dry, I used a small twig that I picked up outside and made little stems for the apples. I cut the twig down to size and hot glued it into the hole on the top of the bead. Then I took some more of those little leaves off the ribbon that I used earlier and put one on each of the little apples. To make it so that the basket would hang off the ladder, I took some twine and hot glued it to the inside of the basket and measured about how long I wanted it to hang, then hot glued the other end down inside the basket as well. Next, I took one of the luau skirts from Dollar Tree and cut off some of the strands so that I could use it as hay in the basket. Now, Dollar Tree does have out little hay bales right now that would be perfect for this. I just didn't have any on hand, so I used the skirt and it worked out fine. Once I had the hay in the basket and trimmed down to size, I took my little tiny apples and placed them in the basket where I wanted them. And that was it for this one. It turned out absolutely adorable and is probably one of my favorites from this whole video. For this DIY, I'm using some craft water that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I followed the stovetop directions on the box and put it in a pan of boiling water on the stove for 15 minutes. Y'all, I've never worked with this stuff before, but it was so easy to do. Y'all can't mess this up. It's almost like a gel candle wax. After letting the craft water boil for 15 minutes, I took it off the stove, poured out the water from the pan, and put the salt shaker from Dollar Tree down onto the still hot pan and poured the craft water into the salt shaker. Be very careful because the bottle of craft water will be extremely hot, so be sure to use an oven mitt. Then I immediately took some Anita's acrylic paint in the color Buttered Yam and mixed it into the craft water. I added the paint gradually and mixed it really well until I got the color I was looking for. I wanted this to look like a glass of apple cider, and I think it turned out perfect. Once I was satisfied with the color, I then added a cinnamon stick and very carefully removed it from the pan and set it aside so the craft water could solidify. I really wanted a smaller cinnamon stick, but this was the smallest one in the package. So once it was completely solidified, I took my miter shears and very carefully cut the top off to make it look a little bit smaller. I am absolutely in love with this glass of apple cider. I was pleasantly surprised at how easy the craft water was to work with, and I still have over a half a bottle left, so I'll be using it again in the future for sure. Here's the final reveal of how my tiered tray turned out. Y'all, I'm absolutely in love with this tiered tray. I had so much fun working on all these projects, and I hope y'all enjoyed them as well. For this project, I started with one of the cookie sheets from the 2-pack that I picked up at Dollar Tree. I started by using a pair of old scissors to cut the edges off the cookie sheet. I made sure to try and cut as close to the design as possible. Please be careful when doing this. These cookie sheet edges can be sharp. Once I had the edges removed, I used a plastic ruler to measure out the width of the pumpkin sections. I measured from the outside of the raised edge in the middle of the ruler over to the edge. Once I had the ruler in place on the cookie sheet, I took a mechanical pencil and used it to draw a straight line the length of the cookie sheet. Then I took a pair of scissors and cut it out. For the large pumpkin, I cut out 8 strips that were roughly 13 inches long. After I had all 8 strips cut out, I took a hole punch and punched a hole in both ends of all 8 strips. I made sure to punch the hole far enough in on the strips so that it would be easy to hot glue the strips together later. Next, using Folk Art brushed metal in the color brushed silver and a coarse paintbrush, I gave all 8 strips 2 light coats, letting them dry between coats. I did make sure to paint both the front and back of the strips because they will be seen once the pumpkin is put together. Once the silver paint was dry, I took some Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin and a smaller brush and went around the edges of the strips. Again, I made sure to do the same thing on the front and the back. I wanted to give these pumpkins the look of rustic metal pumpkins with a hint of color. After the paint was dry, I took the strips out and gave them a good coat of matte Mod Podge sealer. For the pumpkin leaves, I used one of the leaves off a Dollar Tree pumpkin pick and traced around it on a cookie sheet, then cut it out. I did end up making 2 of these leaves for each pumpkin. For the smaller pumpkin, I used the same leaves, but when I cut them out a little bit smaller. After I had the leaves cut out, I used the brushed silver paint and gave both leaves 2 light coats on the front and back. Next, I took some Waverly chalk paint in the color moss and went around the edges of the leaves on the front and back, just like I did with the pumpkin sections. Once the leaves were completely dry, I took them outside and gave them a good coat on the front and back of the matte Mod Podge spray. Then I took one of the 12-inch wooden dowels from Dollar Tree and painted a little over half of it with the brushed silver paint. Next, I took 2 of the tumbling tower blocks from Dollar Tree and painted them with the apple barrel paint in the color chocolate bar. Once all the paint and sealer was completely dry, it was time to assemble the larger pumpkin. To give the strips a curve like a pumpkin, I took the strips and wrapped them around a can of Febreze that I had sitting on the table. But you can use anything that would give the strips a circular shape like a glass, a rolling pin, or anything like that. Next, I took the wooden dowel and placed one end of one of the strips on the bottom using the hole I'd punched earlier, and measured out how tall I wanted the pumpkin to be, then marked the spot on the dowel. Then I took a pair of miter shears and cut the dowel rod a little bit above the spot I had marked. Once I had the dowel cut to size, I then put the strips onto the dowel. This part is a bit tricky because the dowel rod is a bit bigger than the holes, but if you use just a tad bit of pressure, it will go on with no problem. After I had the first strip in place, I put a small dab of hot glue on the underside of the top strip so that it would hold in place. I didn't put any hot glue on the bottom of the pumpkin until all the strips were put in place and glued at the top. Once I had the first strip glued in place, I continued placing the strips on the dowel rod, alternating them so that they mirrored each other, and gluing the top pieces together until I had all 8 strips in place. I do want to mention that I'm using Gorilla Hot Glue, and it holds these cookie sheets together with no problem. Be sure that you have them where you want them before you put the glue on them, because they will not come back apart, and you won't be able to reposition them. I learned that the hard way. After all 8 strips were on and glued together at the top, I turned the pumpkin over and made sure all the strips were on the dowel rod, and then added some hot glue to the dowel rod in the last strip to hold it in place. Then I went through and hot glued each end down into place. This is how the pumpkin should look once all 8 sections are glued into place. Next, I took some wire cutters and snipped off the top of the dowel rod at the top of the pumpkin. For the stem of this pumpkin, I'm using an old spring that I found in my dad's shop, but you could use a piece of a stick, twine, or wire to make your own spring-like stem. I used a generous amount of hot glue to hold the stem in place. Hot glue worked great for me, but if you would prefer a more secure and long-term hold, you could use E6000 or some other long-lasting adhesive. I then used hot glue to attach the 2 leaves to the top of the pumpkin once I was happy with the placement. Since I wanted this pumpkin to stand on its own, I took the 2 tumbling tower blocks I painted earlier, glued them together, and then used hot glue to glue them to the bottom of the pumpkin. And since it just wouldn't be a pumpkin without tendrils, I took some dark colored wire that I also got from my dad and wrapped one long piece around one of the wooden dowels for the long tendril, and then repeated the same steps using a smaller piece of wire for the shorter tendril. Once I was happy with the placement of the tendril, I used some hot glue to glue it into place. Then, once both tendrils were in place, the large pumpkin was finished. I absolutely love the rustic look of this pumpkin. To make the smaller pumpkin, I used the exact same process, except I cut the strips to 10 inches long and I cut the 2 leaves a little bit smaller. I also used a smaller spring for the stem. This is how the smaller pumpkin turned out. I absolutely love it. Y'all, I am so thrilled with how these pumpkins turned out. They were so quick and easy to make, and best of all, both of them together only cost about $2. I love the rustic look and feel of these pumpkins and can't wait to display them with the rest of my fall decor. For this project, I used a 3.4-inch square glass vase from Dollar Tree and 1.5 bags of colorful foam corn from Hobby Lobby that I got for 50% off. I started by cutting one end of the corn so that it would set flat against the table. I made sure to cut the side that had the longest piece of corn husk so that the top of the corn would be fairly even once it was all attached to the vase. The foam is really easy to cut with scissors, but there is a thicker dowel rod in the center that will need to be either pulled out or cut off with some stronger snips. Once I had the end of the corn cut, I determined which side I thought looked best and used a generous amount of hot glue to attach the ear of the corn to the vase with the best side facing outward. I did use hot glue for this step for video purposes, but if you're wanting a longer lasting hold, you could use hot glue in addition to a stronger adhesive such as E6000. Just be sure not to mix the 2 glues together or it will create a hot mess and nothing will adhere. I continued gluing the ears of corn around each side of the vase, alternating the colors to create a pattern of purple, orange, and yellow, but you could arrange them in any order you like. I ended up using 12 ears of corn to complete this project, but that will vary depending on the size of the vase you choose to use. I did try to cover up any large gaps between the ears and did have to use a little bit of hot glue on the sides of the corn to attach the 2 pieces together to close a few gaps and to help them stand up straight. After I had the vase completely covered with corn, I placed a piece of floral foam from Dollar Tree in the vase and then used a mixed dahlia bouquet from Walmart and arranged each of the flowers in the vase until I was happy with the way it looked. After I had all the dahlias arranged in the vase, I took some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree and filled in any of the gaps where you could still see the floral foam. And that's it for this one. It was really quick and easy, and I think it turned out gorgeous. It would be a wonderful addition to any fall tablescape or as a Thanksgiving table centerpiece. For this project, I used a 3.5-inch glass votive candle holder with the back just slightly taller than the front that I picked up 50% off at Hobby Lobby, and a cute little turkey face I traced off a Google image search. This one is a little bit different from what I'm used to doing, but it was super simple and was very easy to do. First, I taped the turkey face to the inside of the votive holder so that I could paint it on the outside of the glass. With the face in place, I used Faux art chalk paint in rich black to paint the pupils and the eyes and the little nostrils, Waverly white chalk paint to paint the rest of the eye, Waverly crimson chalk paint to paint the wattle, and Waverly pumpkin chalk paint to paint the beak. I am not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, and my freehand isn't great, so taping the image on the inside of the glass allowed me to paint on the turkey face just like coloring in a coloring book. I used a fine tip paintbrush and painted on and inside the lines on the outside of the glass, and I did end up doing 3 coats of paint on each section of the face so that it would show up nicely, not have a light shining through it, or look streaky. This is how it looked once it was painted and dry. It turned out so cute that I ended up painting another one so that I could have a pair. To finish off this project, I filled the candle holder up with popcorn kernels and pushed an LED votive candle down inside, and then added a few more kernels to cover up the top of the votive, and that was it for this project. I do love how these turned out. Even though they're not my typical style of DIY, I think they turned out really cute. You could use them for more than just votive candle holders. They would also make cute place settings for a family Thanksgiving dinner. For this project, I started with a 19-inch styrofoam wreath form from Walmart, yellow, brown, gold, and red tulle from Hobby Lobby, and some brown yarn in the color coffee from Walmart. I began by wrapping the entire wreath form using the brown yarn and hot glue. I only used the hot glue at the very beginning of the yarn strand and then again at the end. You don't want to use a lot of hot glue or big dabs of hot glue because it will cause the styrofoam to melt. I do suggest cutting off long pieces of yarn into workable strands and working it in sections instead of trying to wrap the wreath form using the whole skein. That gets awkward quickly and sections are much easier to work with. Once I had the entire wreath form covered with the yarn, I cut 4 pieces of the red tulle roughly 27 inches long and stacked the 4 pieces together. Then I bent them in half. I attached this bundle to the wreath form by making an opening on the inside of the wreath form with the tulle and pulling the ends of the tulle around the outside of the wreath form and back up through the opening. I repeated the steps with the other colors of tulle using 4 pieces per bundle and attached the bundles to the wreath in the pattern of red, gold, brown, and yellow. I then repeated this pattern until I had covered half of the wreath form with the tulle feathers. I ended up using 6 bundles in each color, but depending on the size wreath form you choose to use, you may have more or less of each color. I did not use all the tulle that came on the rolls, so 1 roll in each color will be more than enough for a 19-inch wreath. Once I had the tulle on the wreath, I went back through and made sure each bundle was pulled nice and tight. For the beak of the turkey, I took a 2.5-inch styrofoam cone from a 2-pack I picked up at Walmart and painted it entirely with Waverly pumpkin chalk paint. While I was waiting for the beak to dry, I used a red foam sheet from Crafter's Square at Dollar Tree and a template I made to cut out the turkey's wattle. For the turkey's eyes, I used 2 of the 1.3-inch styrofoam balls from Dollar Tree. To make the pupils for the eyes, I used Faux art chalk paint in rich black and a 3/4-inch round sponge. To paint the pupils on the styrofoam ball, all I did was dip the sponge in the paint and dab off the excess paint that was around the edges. Then I pressed it in the center of the styrofoam ball with just a little bit of pressure. After all the paint was dry, it was time to finish up this turkey and assemble the face. I used a generous amount of hot glue to attach all the elements of the face onto the wreath form. I glued the beak as centered as possible on the bottom of the wreath form, then I glued the wattle on the side of the beak. I then glued 1 eye on each side of the beak directly onto the wreath form. That's it for this one. I think it turned out adorable. I will say if I were to make this wreath again, I would cut the beak down just a little shorter. But other than that, I'm really happy with this Pinterest-inspired turkey wreath. For this super quick and easy project, I used one of these wooden pumpkin decor pieces from Dollar Tree. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color white and painted the entire piece with 2 good coats. Next, I took 4 of these large magnets from Dollar Tree and used a piece of sandpaper to scuff up the surface so that they could be painted. I then painted them with 2 good coats of Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. Next, I took one of these 6-inch wooden dowels from Dollar Tree and cut 1.5 inches off of one end. I used the Kona stain to stain the 2 pieces of dowel rod. I used hot glue to attach the magnets onto the bottom base of the pumpkin for the wheels, making sure they were roughly in the same place so that the wagon would not wobble around. I then used more hot glue to attach the long dowel rod to the right side of the pumpkin and then to attach the smaller dowel rod across the top to create a handle for the wagon. You could use wood glue or a stronger adhesive if you wanted, but I chose to use hot glue and it's held up well. Then, to finish off this adorable little pumpkin wagon, I took one of these LED tea light candles from Dollar Tree and placed it down inside the pumpkin. And that's all there was for this one. I absolutely love how this little pumpkin wagon turned out. I think it would look so cute on a tiered tray or with some fall florals as a vase. For this project, I used one of these carvable pumpkins from Dollar Tree. I started by removing the pumpkin stem and cutting the pumpkin in half along the seam where it was put together. Once I had the pumpkin cut in half, I cut one of the halves down even further by about 3/4 of an inch so that I would have one large pumpkin and one small pumpkin. Next, I painted both pumpkin pieces with about 3 coats of Waverly chalk paint in the color ivory, letting it dry completely between coats. After the paint was dry, I painted the smaller pumpkin piece with about 3 coats of apple barrel paint in the color orange sherbet, again letting it dry completely between coats. Then I took 2 pieces of wood 11 inches long and 2 pieces of wood 14 inches long and stained them with 2 heavy coats of the Kona wood stain. Once the stain was dry, I took one of the ready board foam boards from Dollar Tree and laid out the wood pieces to form a frame. I then traced around the wood pieces with a pencil and used a sharp utility knife to cut the piece out of the foam board. After I had the foam piece cut, I took some burlap from Walmart and used hot glue to attach it to the front of the board. Next, I used a generous amount of hot glue on the backs of the wood pieces and placed them back on top of the burlap and foam board so that it would create a frame. Once I had all 4 wood pieces attached to the foam board, I went around the edges and cut off all the excess foam board and burlap. I also went ahead and took the Kona stain and stained the edges of the foam board so that it would blend in better with the wood. I used a generous amount of hot glue around the edge of the large pumpkin half to attach it to the center of the foam board and about 1.5 inches from the bottom. I then used more hot glue to attach the smaller pumpkin half to the foam board on top of the larger half to make a pumpkin stack. Next, I used hot glue to add some raffia to the bottom of the foam board to make it look like the pumpkins were stacked on hay. You're going to see here in a bit that I did end up going back in and adding some more raffia to the sides of the pumpkins. I went outside and picked up a small half stick to use as the pumpkin stem, and I used 2 more of the grapevine leaves. I hot glued the 2 leaves right above the small pumpkin directly onto the foam board. I then used hot glue to attach the stem in the middle of the 2 leaves on top of the small pumpkin. I decided I wanted the large leaf to lay on top of the small pumpkin, so I used a small dab of hot glue to hold it in place. Next, I took these metal words from Dollar Tree and picked out the word harvest and painted it with a couple coats of Waverly chalk paint in the color white. Here you'll see that I went ahead and added more raffia around the sides of the frame and the pumpkins. Then, to finish up this project, I used hot glue to attach the word harvest in the center of the top of the frame. I used hot glue, but I would recommend using a stronger adhesive here since hot glue and metal are not friends. Here's how the sign turned out. I love it. I think it is absolutely adorable and it fits in with my rustic fall decor perfectly. For this super quick and easy project, I used 2 of these faux red apples that I picked up in a bag of fruit on sale at Hobby Lobby. I also used a 2-pack of these LED tea light candles from Dollar Tree. I started by removing the stem from one of the apples and placed one of the tea lights on top of the apple and used a black Sharpie to trace around the candle so that I would know exactly where to cut. Next, I took a sharp X-Acto knife and carefully cut around the circle into the top of the apple. Once I had the circle cut, I removed the latex from the top of the apple and used a pair of small scissors to help remove the styrofoam and to create a little hole for the tea light to sit down inside. I then used one of these white candles from Dollar Tree and carefully let the wax drip all the way around the opening at the top and down the sides a bit to give it the illusion of a candle melting inside the apple. Best part about this DIY is you can't mess it up. If you accidentally get too much wax on the apple, you can easily scrape it back off and start again. When I was happy with the amount of wax on the apple, I set it aside and let the wax fully harden. Once the wax was fully hard, I placed the tea light back down inside the apple, and this little easy project is done. I then repeated these steps on the other apple to give me a set of 2 faux apple candle holders that will be perfect for my mantle this fall. I really love these little candle holders. I've always liked apple tea light candle holders, but I have a hard time wasting raw apples for decor purposes, so this solves that problem completely. For this project, I used 2 of these large mesh strainers from Dollar Tree and some of this pure pumpkin scented potpourri from Hobby Lobby. I found it easiest to pour the potpourri into a large bowl so that I could easily pick and choose from the contents, and started filling up one of the mesh strainers until it was full enough so that it would fill both strainers once they were put together. I did try to put a little bit of everything from the potpourri into the strainer for a nice variety. After I had the strainer filled, I placed the other strainer on top to create a little cage for the potpourri. Next, I used a little bit of hot glue to attach some jute twine to one set of the bottom loops and wrapped the twine around a few times until I was happy with the way it looked, and used another dab of hot glue to secure the end in place. I then repeated this step to wrap the other set of bottom loops. This will not only hold the strainers closed, but it will also add a little extra decor to this piece. I also used hot glue in between the 2 handles to secure them together. I was not a huge fan of the silver around the outside of the strainers, so I decided to cover it with the jute twine using hot glue to secure it in place. I really like this rustic look the twine gave to this piece much better than the silver, and it matches my decor better. Next, I used the twine to wrap the handles of the strainers using dabs of hot glue as needed to secure it in place. Then when I got to the top of the handles, I made sure to completely cover the end using hot glue to secure the twine in place. To decorate this piece, I used these beige leaves that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby. I used 2 of the leaves and placed them around the bottom of the handle and used hot glue to secure them in place. Next, I took one of these large cotton bowls from Dollar Tree and used the wire on the back of it to secure it to the handle. I also used one of the smaller cotton bowls from Dollar Tree and attached it to the other side of the large cotton bowl, sitting just a little higher. I then cut the excess wire off the back of the cotton. Then, to finish up this project, I used the pumpkin leather tag from this 2-pack from Dollar Tree. I cut the hanger so that it wasn't as long and used hot glue to attach the 2 strings back together. I then used hot glue to attach the tag to the top right side of the handle just underneath the cotton bowls. I then repeated these steps using these small mesh strainers from Dollar Tree to create a smaller potpourri pumpkin. This is how the small potpourri pumpkin turned out, and I'm not sure which one I like best. Here's a look at both the large and small potpourri pumpkins. Y'all, these smell so good and cost so little to make. I can't wait to scatter them throughout my house this fall. For this project, I used 3 of these silver serving trays from Dollar Tree. I used Rust-Oleum spray paint in the color gloss white and gave the trays 2 good coats on the front and back. I also used one of these wooden finials from Hobby Lobby. I wanted it to sit down over the edge of one of the trays, so I took it out and made a slit the width of a saw blade in the bottom. I then used Krylon antiquing wax in the color dark vintage to stain the finial. Next, I cut out a piece of cowhide fabric from Hobby Lobby that would fit down inside the indentation in the center of the serving tray. I applied a generous layer of Mod Podge in the center of the tray and placed the cowhide fabric on top, smoothing out all the edges so that there were no bubbles, and set it aside to dry for a couple of hours. I then repeated this step to add the cowhide fabric to the centers of the other 2 trays. I also tried to cut out different patterns from the fabric so that I would have a different look for each tray. Next, I took some twine and used hot glue to attach it around the outside of the fabric to hide the uneven edges and to give the trays a nice finished look. I did end up taking a pair of small scissors and trimming up all the twine fuzzies so that it would look a bit neater and more finished. I used more of the Krylon antiquing wax in the color Dark Vintage to distress along the sides of each of the serving trays, applying it kind of heavy with a coarse brush and using a paper towel to gently wipe off the excess. I really wanted those details on the edges of the trays to pop. Here is how all 3 trays looked once they were finished. To put the pumpkin together, I placed the 2 bottom trays against each other, making sure they were even at the bottom, and placed Gorilla Glue super glue along the 2 edges of the trays that were touching each other. I then placed the last tray on top of the glue, making sure it was centered and even at the bottom with the other 2 trays, and set it aside to dry for a couple of hours. To make the stem of the pumpkin, I placed some super glue into the slit on the bottom of the finial and placed it over the top edge of the front tray and set it aside to dry. Next, I took this wooden Hello Fall cutout from this Harvest DIY word set that I picked up at Dollar Tree and painted it front and back with 2 coats of apple barrel paint in the color Antique White. To finish up this project, I used one of the large brown leaves and one of the small brown leaves from this pick that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I used hot glue to attach the large leaf to the right side of the stem. Next, I used hot glue to attach the smaller leaf to the large leaf. I then took some jute twine and wrapped it around the bottom of the finial a few times and tied it in a knot, leaving just enough extra twine over the leaves to attach the words Hello Fall with hot glue. I cut off all the excess twine and this one is finished. I am absolutely in love with how this pumpkin turned out. For this project, I used one of these wooden oval plaques from Dollar Tree and one of these wooden candle holders from Hobby Lobby. I used Rust-Oleum wood stain in the color American Walnut and stained both the wooden oval and the candlestick. Once both pieces were completely dry, I used Gorilla Glue super glue to attach the wooden oval to the top of the candlestick. Next, I used 2 packs of this wired jute from Dollar Tree. I cut 4 pieces of the jute that were 28 inches long. I also want to mention that I did use small dabs of hot glue on the ends of each piece of wired jute to help keep them from unraveling. I placed some hot glue in the center of the wooden oval and placed one of the jute pieces on top. You want to make sure the piece of jute is about even on both sides, so I folded the wired jute in half to get it close to center. Next, I added more glue on top of the first piece of jute and placed another piece of jute on top, going in the opposite direction to create a crisscross pattern. I continued adding the other 2 pieces of jute to the wood oval by applying the hot glue to the center and placing the jute on top, making sure they were crisscrossing to make the 8 sections of the pumpkin. Once I had all the jute in place, I gathered all the ends together at the top and twisted them together to secure the sections and to create the stem. I then took the leftover wired jute and wrapped it around the stem for added security and to give it a little bulk. After I had the stem completely wrapped, I used a dab of hot glue to secure the end and used a pair of pliers to pinch it together. With the stem in place, I went around the sections of the pumpkin and shaped them to look more like an actual pumpkin. Here's how it looked once I was happy with the shape. Next, I took one of these wood slices that I had in my stash and used hot glue to attach it to the center inside the pumpkin. I also used some of the leftover wired jute to make a tendril and used hot glue to attach it to the top of the pumpkin. To decorate this pumpkin, I used some neutral browns and cream florals from Hobby Lobby and Walmart and a flameless LED candle. I really do love how this one turned out. I am loving the neutral browns and creams for this fall, and although I do love the traditional oranges and reds, I think this year I may stick with the neutrals in my decor. For this project, I used one of these 16 by 20 oval canvases from Hobby Lobby. I started by using a flathead screwdriver and a pair of pliers to carefully remove all the staples from the back of the canvas. Once I had all the staples removed, I removed the canvas from the frame and smoothed out the canvas flat on the table. I then set the frame back on top of the canvas and took a pencil and traced around the inside of the frame. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the inside of the oval. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color truffle to paint the frame. After everything was dry, I trimmed down the canvas so that it was easier to work with and placed the frame on top, making sure none of the white canvas was showing, and used dabs of hot glue on each side and the top and bottom to tack the canvas in place. Next, I flipped it over and used a staple gun to reattach the canvas to the back of the frame, pulling it so that it was nice and tight and had a more permanent hold. I traced the quote, "And the leaves fell from the trees without regret," onto a piece of printer paper and used a regular pencil to shade the back of the paper so that I could transfer the words to the canvas. I then placed the paper onto the canvas where I wanted the words and used Scotch tape to hold it in place. I used a pen and traced around the letters to transfer them to the canvas. Here is how it looked once the words were transferred. I used a white paint marker to fill in the words. To decorate the canvas, I used the leaves out of these 2 laser-cut icon packs from Dollar Tree. I placed the leaves around the words to fill in the empty space, and once I was happy with the way it looked, I used small dabs of hot glue to secure them in place, and that's it for this one. I am thrilled with the way this canvas turned out. I think it's simple yet beautiful and a perfect reminder of fall. For this project, I used one of these 15.6-inch foam wreath forms from Hobby Lobby and some of this brown faux leather also from Hobby Lobby. I started by cutting 6 strips of the leather that were 1 inch wide. Then, using hot glue to secure the ends in place, I wrapped the entire wreath form with the leather strips. I wrapped the leather as tight as possible without a lot of overlapping, using hot glue as needed to hold the leather in place. As you can see here, there are a few small gaps between the leather, so I took some of this 4mm braided leather cord in distressed brown from Amazon and used hot glue to attach it to the back of the wreath and wrapped it around the entire wreath, making sure to cover up all the seams and the gaps between each of the wraps. To decorate this wreath, I used 2 of these cream and brown floral picks, 1 of these cream, brown, and green floral picks, and 2 of these cream grass floral picks, all of which I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby. I created a swag with the florals and used some floral wire to attach all of the stems together in the middle. Then, to attach the swag to the wreath, I used another small strip of the leather and hot glued it to the center of the swag and around the back side of the wreath form. For a little added security and more decor, I cut a wider piece of the leather and hot glued it on top of the swag and tightly tucked in the sides using hot glue to hold them in place, and this one is finished. Y'all, I couldn't be happier with the way this wreath turned out. I love the rustic, worn look the leather gives to this piece and how it makes the cream-colored florals pop. For this project, I used one of these 5-inch plastic plates from Dollar Tree and drilled a hole in the center using a 3/8-inch drill bit. Now these plates do crack really easy, so I put my drill on the lowest setting and slowly drilled the hole without it cracking. Next, I used one of these plastic bed risers from Walmart. I placed the plastic plate on the front of the bed riser where I wanted it to sit and used a pencil to mark where I needed to drill the hole, using the hole in the plate as a guide. I then used the 3/8-inch drill bit to drill the hole in the bed riser. I also used one of these wooden dollhouse tables from Dollar Tree, this small burner cover that comes in a 2-pack from Dollar Tree, and 4 of these small wooden cubes that also comes from Dollar Tree. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin to paint all the pieces front and back with a few good coats. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and this stencil brush from Dollar Tree and heavily dry brushed all the pieces front and back. Finally, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color truffle and this stencil brush and again heavily dry brushed the pieces to distress them and make them look old and worn. Next, I used this small picture from this Harvest Meadow scrapbook paper pack from Michaels and cut the paper into a small circle so that it would fit down inside the plastic plate. I then used a glue stick to adhere the paper to the center of the plate. Once the glue was dry, I used a generous amount of Mod Podge and a sponge brush to seal the paper, paying extra attention to the edges to make sure they were fully adhered to the plate, and set it aside to dry for a couple of hours. After the plate was completely dry, I took a pair of scissors and opened the hole in the middle back up, making sure to go from the front to the back so that the front had a nice clean look. Next, I used some of these small clock numbers from Hobby Lobby that already have the adhesive on the back. I started by placing 12, 3, 6, and 9 onto the clock face in the appropriate positions, and then placed the rest of the numbers, trying to space them out as evenly as possible. I did use a pair of tweezers to help place the numbers and a pair of small scissors to remove them from the plastic. I did not have to use any additional adhesive on the numbers. Next, I used hot glue to attach one wood cube to the bottom of each of the table legs. Once I had them all in place, I placed more hot glue on the bottom of each cube and placed the table down inside the top of the bed riser. Then I used more hot glue to attach the burner cover to the top of the table, trying to get it as centered as possible. I used this 3/8 inch clock movement kit from Hobby Lobby to turn this into a working clock. I placed the mechanism inside the riser and then placed the clock face on top and followed the directions on the back of the kit to assemble the clock, and this one is finished. I am absolutely thrilled with how this vintage kitchen scale clock turned out. It's going to be the perfect addition to my fall kitchen decor. For this project, I used 2 of these pumpkin wood cutouts from Dollar Tree, this piece of wood from this wood economy bag from Hobby Lobby that is about 7 inches long and 4 inches wide, and 2 of these square wooden planks from Dollar Tree. I started by placing one of the square planks against the right side of the larger wood piece, and making sure that one side was completely flush, I took a pencil and marked the plank so that I would know where to cut. I then repeated this step using the other plank and the left side of the wood piece. Once I had both planks marked, I cut off the excess so that they would sit flush with the larger wood piece. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin to paint all 5 pieces front and back with one good coat. Once that was dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and a stencil brush and heavily dry brushed all 5 pieces front and back and used it to create the sections of the pumpkin. Then I used Waverly chalk paint in the color truffle and a small brush to dry brush the stems of the pumpkins and along the edges of all 5 pieces. To decorate the first pumpkin, I used this leather leaf and some jute cord that I had in my stash. I used hot glue to attach it to the top of the pumpkin and around the stem to hide where the colors change. I also attached it to the back of the pumpkin to give it a nice finished look and cut off any excess jute. I then repeated this step to add jute around the stem of the second pumpkin, making sure the stems were facing in opposite directions so that the back seam will be on the inside of the basket. To put the basket together, I applied hot glue along one edge of the bottom wood piece and placed one of the planks on top, making sure it was flush on the bottom. I then repeated this step to attach the other plank to the other side of the bottom piece. Next, I placed hot glue along the edges of the side pieces and the bottom piece and placed the front pumpkin on top, trying to get it as centered as possible and making sure that it would sit flush at the bottom. I flipped the entire piece over and making sure the stems were facing the same direction, I hot glued the back pumpkin in place, centering it and making sure it sat flush at the bottom. Here is how the basket looked once it was put together. I used one of these old wire clothes hangers to make the handle of the basket. Using a pair of wire cutters, I cut off one of the bent sections of the hanger, leaving a small hook on one end. I then slipped that hook through the hole on the top of the front pumpkin and used a pair of pliers to pinch it closed. Next, I carefully used the pair of pliers to bend the hanger into a handle. I used 3 of these small wooden beads from Amazon and placed them onto the handle and then used the pliers to bend a hook in the other end of the wire. I then placed the hook through the hole on the back pumpkin stem and pinched it closed. I used small dabs of hot glue to help keep the beads in place in the center of the handle, and this one is finished. I am so happy with the way this basket turned out. It can be used in so many different ways, but for right now, I think I'm just going to add an arrangement of fall florals from Walmart. For this project, I used one of these wire pumpkin wreath forms from Dollar Tree and some of this wool yarn from Walmart in the color oatmeal. I started by wrapping the entire frame of the wreath including the stem with the oatmeal colored yarn, using hot glue as needed to secure it in place. Once I had the frame completely wrapped, I flipped the pumpkin over and started filling in the center. I placed a dab of hot glue on each point where the yarn was going to be in contact with the frame and placed the yarn on top to adhere it to the wreath. I continued to add rows of the yarn until I had the entire center of the pumpkin covered. If there were any large gaps between the rows, I added a small amount of hot glue to adhere the two pieces of yarn together. After I had the center of the pumpkin filled, I went back and trimmed all the edges and loose pieces of yarn. Then, to decorate the pumpkin, I used these scrap pieces of fall florals that I had left over in my stash. I placed the largest floral piece first, placing one of the stems through the stem of the pumpkin, and used hot glue to secure it in place. Next, I placed the brown-colored berries just below the stem and used hot glue to secure them in place. Finally, I placed the cream-colored berries right under the brown berries and secured them in place with hot glue. To finish off this wreath, I made a simple shoestring bow using more of the yarn and used hot glue to secure it to the top of the pumpkin right under the stem to cover up where I attached the floral pieces. I absolutely love how this pumpkin wreath turned out. This is my first time using one of these wreath forms, and this is hands down one of my all-time favorite wreaths that I have ever created. For this project, I used one of these wire pumpkin wreath forms from Dollar Tree and some of these brown paper bags. I started by cutting the very bottom off of the paper bag and then cut the bag open so that I had one solid long piece of paper. I then repeated this step until I had several strips of brown paper. Once I had all the bags cut, I took one of the strips and loosely twisted it. I then used hot glue to attach the top of the strip to the wreath form and then twisted it around the wire frame and secured the bottom of the strip to the wreath form with more hot glue. I then repeated this step until I had all the wire strips on the wreath form covered. If one strip of paper wasn't long enough to cover the wire strip of the wreath form, I used hot glue to attach two of the bags together and cut off the excess bag once I had it wrapped around the wire and secured into place. Here is how the wreath form looked once I had all the wires covered with the paper. After I had all the strips attached to each of the wires, I started adding more of the paper bag strips in between each of them to completely fill in the wreath form. I did go ahead and add hot glue as needed to the sides of the strips so that there were no visible gaps. If by chance the gaps was too big to fill just by gluing the strips together, I made smaller strips from the paper bags to fill them in. Here's how the wreath looked once I had all the paper strips glued into place. I used Rust-Oleum Glossy Spray Paint in the color Real Orange and took the wreath outside and gave the front and back 2 good coats. To make the stem, once the pumpkin was completely dry, I cut one of the paper bag strips in half and wrapped it around the stem and twisted the end into the shape of a pumpkin stem. Once I was happy with the way the stem looked, I used hot glue to secure it in place at the bottom on the front and back of the pumpkin. Then, to finish up this wreath, I took a few strands of raffia from a Dollar Tree hula skirt and wrapped it around the bottom of the stem, tied it in a simple shoestring bow, and used a dab of hot glue to hold it in place. I went ahead and trimmed up the tails of the bow, and this one is finished. I am super happy with how this wreath turned out. I love the rustic look and texture of the pumpkin and can't wait to add it to my decor. For this project, I used 3 of these large chunky wooden ovals from Hobby Lobby. I used Minwax wood finish in the color red oak to stain the sides and backs of all 3 ovals. Next, I cut out an oval piece of faux cowhide fabric and 2 oval pieces of faux leather fabric that fit on the front of the ovals. To attach the fabric to the wooden oval, I applied a generous layer of Mod Podge to the front of the oval and placed the cowhide fabric on top. I smoothed out all the lumps and wrinkles and set it aside to dry for a few hours. I then repeated this step to adhere the faux leather fabric to the front of the other 2 wooden ovals. I also used one of these wooden finials from Hobby Lobby and stained it with Minwax wood finish in the color red oak. Once everything was completely dry, I used some hot glue to attach the 2 leather ovals together in the middle, making sure the bottoms were flush with one another. Next, I applied hot glue to the back side of the cowhide oval and placed it in the middle of the two leather ovals, again making sure the bottoms were all flush with each other so that the pumpkin stands on its own. Then I used hot glue to attach the finial to the top center of the cowhide oval to create the pumpkin stem. To finish off this pumpkin, I took some raffia from a Dollar Tree hula skirt and wrapped it around the bottom of the stem, tied it in a knot, and trimmed up the raffia, and this one is finished. I admit I'm a sucker for these types of wooden pumpkins, and then to throw in some faux cowhide and faux leather, yep, I'm sold. For this project, I used this 2-pack of foam dice from Dollar Tree. First, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and gave both dice 3 coats. Then I used apple barrel paint in the color toasted marshmallow and gave both dice 1 coat. Next, I roughly sketched out a male scarecrow face on one of the die and a female scarecrow face on the other. I used a fine tip black marker to fill in the eyes and the rest of the facial features of both scarecrows. I then used a fine tip orange marker to fill in the nose of both scarecrows. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Snow White to fill in the white parts of the scarecrow's eyes. I used long pieces of raffia as the hair on the female scarecrow and used hot glue to secure it in place. Once I had all the raffia glued into place, I took some scissors and trimmed up the sides so that the die would sit flat on the tray. Next, I took some of this orange fall ribbon from Dollar Tree and tied a simple bow and used hot glue to attach it to the top of the scarecrow's head, then dovetailed the ends, and this little scarecrow is finished. For the male scarecrow, I hot glued some shorter pieces of raffia to the top of the die for hair. I then used one of these mini scarecrow hats from Dollar Tree and used hot glue to attach it to the top of the scarecrow, and this little guy is finished. I think this set of scarecrows turned out absolutely adorable. I absolutely love how all these DIYs came together to create a fun and festive fall display. For this project, I used this 2-pack of 10-inch grapevine wreaths from Hobby Lobby and 2 packs of this reindeer moss from the Dollar Tree. I kept the 2 wreaths attached to each other to make one thicker wreath, and working in sections, I used hot glue to attach the reindeer moss around a little less than half of the wreath, making sure to cover the front, back, and sides of the wreath with the moss. Next, I used some of these puka pods from this package that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby. I picked out several of the pods that looked the most like pumpkins and used hot glue to attach them around the moss-covered section of the wreath, and this one is finished. I am in love with the way this wreath turned out. I made a mini version for my fall tiered tray, but I wanted one to go on this mini wreath stand that I keep on my mantle. For this project, I used one of these long wood hanging decor signs from the Dollar Tree and removed the jute hanger. I then gave it 1 coat of Waverly antique wax. I also used 7 of these 3-inch wooden tags from Hobby Lobby that come in a pack of 6. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin and gave the front and sides of each tag 1 light coat. Once the paint was completely dry, I laid the tags out onto the front of the sign, spacing them out as evenly as possible, and used hot glue to attach them to the sign, using a ruler to help keep them in a straight line. Next, I used these wooden letters from this pack of 1-inch script letters from Hobby Lobby and used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the front and sides of each letter with 1 light coat. Once the paint was dry, I placed one of the letters on each of the tags to spell out the word harvest and used hot glue to secure them in place, again using a ruler to help keep them straight. I also used 4 of these 3/4-inch wooden half beads from Amazon and gave them 1 coat of Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. After the paint was dry, I used hot glue to attach one of the wooden beads to each corner of the sign, making sure to cover up the holes from the hanger. To cover up the holes on the top of the tags, I took some pieces of a boxwood pick and cut off 3 leaves and used hot glue to attach them to the top of the tag. To finish up the pumpkin tags, I made 7 tiny shoestring bows using the jute that came with the tags and used hot glue to attach 1 to the top of each tag. Next, I took 3 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree and gave them 1 coat of Waverly antique wax. Then to finish off this sign, I used hot glue to attach the tumbling tower blocks to the back of the sign so that it would stand on its own. Now I used hot glue for this project for video purposes, but I would recommend using wood glue or a stronger adhesive for a more permanent hold. I'm super happy with the way this little sign turned out. It makes a perfect filler piece for a shelf. For this project, I used this wooden pumpkin cutout from the Dollar Tree and gave it one coat of Waverly Antique Wax. I also used 34 of these 3/4 inch wooden half beads from Amazon and gave them all one coat of Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. Once the paint was dry, I used hot glue to attach them around the inside edge of the pumpkin, leaving a tiny gap between each of the beads. I then took some of this 4-ply jute cord and used hot glue to attach it around the outside edge of the pumpkin and to wrap the stem. Next, I used one of these 7-inch wooden welcome words from Hobby Lobby and used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the front and sides with one coat. Once the paint was dry, I used hot glue to attach it to the pumpkin underneath the stem, trying to get it as centered as possible. I then used these wooden letters from this pack of 1.25-inch typewriter letters from Hobby Lobby and used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to give the fronts and sides one light coat. After the paint was dry, I used hot glue to attach them to the front of the pumpkin underneath the word welcome, trying to space them out as evenly as possible. Then to finish up this project, I tied a simple shoestring bow with 2 pieces of raffia and used hot glue to attach it to the stem of the pumpkin right above the wooden beads and then trimmed up the tails. I'm loving the neutral colors and the natural textures of this pumpkin.